everyone, David Aragona and Craig Milkowski are taking a look at the DRF Saturday Race of the Day. It is the Grade 2 Red Smith Stakes, Race 9 at Aqueduct, going 1.3 miles on the turf. And Craig, we've got a full field signed on for this race, 12 entered for the turf with a few also eligible entrants. This is a highly competitive affair.
It is. It's a good start to this Aqueduct meet. We're getting good full fields and even in the two stakes races. And this one certainly didn't disappoint. It's a good competitive race of a lot of solid runners.
The horse to beat pretty clearly is the number 8 Soldier Rising, who I pegged as the lukewarm 3-1 morning line favorite. He's just the class of this field, but he's not exactly a horse that loves to win races. He's had 9 seconds to go along with just 4 victories in his career, so we'll see if this slight drop in class can get him over the hump. Before we take a look at the Timeform US pace projector for this race, remember that you can check out free PPs for this race on the DRF Saturday Race of the Day event page. Throwing up the pace projector, Craig, this does feel like a race where the pace could really heat up, and I'll be interested to see how it plays out because typically we don't get that much speed in these turf marathon races, but it does feel like there are at least 3 horses that have intentions of going to the front end.
Yeah, and looking at the pace projector, it's the 3 horses you would expect. Particularly the one that I guess is the most interesting is So High, who kind of ran off last time in that Joe Hurst Turf Classic, opened up almost 20 lengths on the front end and held on for a good third. And I would imagine they're not too interested in changing their tactics given that good result. He was 90-1 that day. But as you say, there's some other speed in here in Main Event and Tide of the Sea, both of whom do their best running on the front end. So things could get pretty interesting up front.
Yeah, I generally agree with this pace projector. It feels like something's going to have to give with those 3 runners that want to be forward, that are shown leading on the pace projector. We usually say sometimes you want to take these turf marathon pace projectors with a grain of salt because the paces can be so variable, but it does feel like something's going to have to give if these 3 horses all go. Let's go through the field in post position order, beginning with the number 1, Lost Ark. And this horse just has 1 prior turf effort under his belt. That came going 1.16 miles in the Saranac at Saratoga over the summer. It was a decent enough effort, sort of in line with his dirt races, Craig, but I feel like he'd have to do better stretching out against this field. He did draw the rail. He's got Irad Ortiz. Those are all positives, but he still needs some improvement.
Yeah, and he's just a 3-year-old against a field of older horses. And his one turf race, I guess it was promising. He's trying a mile, 1.3 here, big stretch out, but just feels like he'll get over bet with the connections. You mentioned Irad Ortiz, trained by Todd Pletcher. Really doesn't have the credentials to win a race like this.
The number 2 is So High, who is that horse we were mentioning with regard to the pace projector, just ran off on the front end last time in that Joe Hurst Turf Classic, opened up nearly 20 lengths on the field and took a huge lead into the stretch before getting run down at the very end. Craig, this horse has been a bit of an overachiever in some big stakes races. He's run some of his highest speed figures in Grade 1 events like the Manhattan, the United Nations, though that Turf Classic 3rd place finish was one of the best results that he's achieved. We'll see if he can do it again in a similar marathon event, but it does feel like he's going to have some more pressure this time.
There'll be more pressure, and it obviously wouldn't be as big of a surprise as it was last time. So maybe he won't be able to get away with it, open up quite so much. And frankly, the huge lead is what allowed him to hold on for 3rd more than his finish. So seems a bit of a stretch, but I'm certainly interested to see what he does early.
The number 3 is Main Event, another horse that wants to be forwardly placed in this race. We'll take a look at his most recent victory in an allowance race at Aqueduct just 8 days ago. So he'd be coming back on relatively short rest, and you can see he's digging in on the inside to hold off a rival that's running at him to the wire here. Main Event is a horse who has done his best running when he's able to control on the front end, and it remains to be seen if he can do that against this field.
And he ran a very nice speed figure last time, a 121. But as you said, there's other speed in here. He's also stretching out to a distance he hasn't tried by a full 2 furlongs. So he's not for me, but hopefully he helps liven up the pace.
The number 4 is Cross Border, the 9-year-old in this race, and it sort of feels like he's had 9 lives, Craig, because he just keeps coming back into form after throwing in some clunkers. And it seemed like he might have been finished at the end of last year after throwing in some poor efforts over the jumps and came back to flat racing, didn't do much right away, but seems like he got back into form in this race. We're looking at here the Cape Henlopen at Delaware, going the 1.5-mile distance. He produced that kick that we were accustomed to seeing from the old Cross Border to get it done. Possibly he's having a renaissance as a late season 9-year-old.
It's possible. You never want to underestimate Mike Maker in these marathon races. It's not like it was a very weak field. The horse he beat at Delaware, Tawny Port, has been pretty solid on the turf since making that transition. So probably not a horse that I would be interested to bet, but it wouldn't shock me if he turns out to be very competitive.
The number 5 is Limited Liability. He's coming out of a one-paced third-place finish in the Sycamore last time, where he was picking up some ground at the end of that race. He's run pretty well in his stakes races and stretching out to marathon distances this year, picking up a series of minor awards. But when you watch his races, Craig, he's just a horse that doesn't possess much turn of foot, and he's going to really need things to fall apart to have his best chance. The good news is, based on the pace projector, that might actually happen.
Yeah, he's very consistent. He showed he could handle the distance last time, going a little further in the Sycamore. As I said, he doesn't really have that turn of foot. He just kind of grinds in his races, but maybe that'll turn out nicely if the pace heats up like we expect it to.
Let's take a look at the last race of the number 6, 911 Turbo, when he was a narrow winner as the favorite of an allowance race going 1.5 miles at Keeneland. And Craig, you really can't knock this horse's recent form. He's won, I believe, 5 of his last 6 races, has just been a win machine on the turf for trader Neil Drysdale recently on both coasts, came to hand on the West Coast in Southern California, was second to the very good Gold Phoenix 2-back going this distance in the Del Mar Handicap, and he was able to take his show to Kentucky last time. We'll see if he can continue improving when he goes up to New York.
Yeah, as you said, he's a win machine. I remember I tried to beat him on our forecast last time. That didn't work out too well. And the loss to Gold Phoenix even looks better than it did in the past, given that one's really good showing in the Breeders' Cup turf. So I'll probably try to beat him again, as we'll see when we get to the selections. He doesn't quite have the speed figures of some others in here, and I assume he's going to be maybe the second choice. I forget what the morning line showed, but I'm sure he's going to take some money, and he's certainly a contender given that he's just red hot and shows up every time.
The number 7 is Marwad, a horse that sort of came out of nowhere to run some big races at Gulfstream last winter. Was an impressive winner going this distance in an allowance race 3-back, and then basically improved on that when he was a good second in the Grade 2 Mac Diarmida behind Value Engineering, who was in good form back then. Craig, when you watch those races back, he did not have particularly good trips in either of those races. Drew outside post positions, was wide all the way around the track, particularly in that Mac Diarmida, where he was 3 to 4 wide around all 3 turns. This horse was in great form last winter, obviously went to the sidelines, came back and didn't show much on synthetic, but perhaps that was just a prep race.
Yeah, I mean, his grass races are better. I'd also argue he didn't have the greatest trip in that return, and I'm not sure how well meant he was for that one either. He lost a lot of ground on that synthetic surface, and his speed figure in that Mac Diarmida, I won't try that name again. Got a little tongue-tied there. But yeah, his speed figure would make him a very strong contender here.
He is second off the layoff, so we'll see if we get a better effort going back to the turf and stretching out from the number 7 Marwad. The number 8 is Soldier Rising, the morning line favorite in this race. We'll take a look at his last race now. That is so high, the 90-1 shot that we already talked about out on the front end. And Soldier Rising, one of the last horses to turn into the stretch this day, but he's able to wear down that leader and just get up for second at the wire behind Warlike Goddess, who was a decisive winner of this race. You really can't knock Soldier Rising's form, Craig. I believe he's competed in 4 Grade 1 races this year, and I think he's been second in all of them. So he shows up, just not quite getting it done on the win end. We'll see if the dropping class gets him over the hump.
That's the big question is, does this horse want to win? I mean, if you look at the horses who have beat him this year, outside of Channel Maker, who in a race where he didn't really run well, they would all be heavy favorites, the horses he ran second to. And I don't want to hold the seconds too much against him. It's not like he was in stretch battles in any of those races and just outgained that didn't have the will to win. He was just beat by much better horses by good margin. So I think he's got a good shot in here given those speed figures.
The number 9 is Red Run. He's gone back and forth between dirt and turf in his career. Went back to turf recently for Mike Maker. Ran well to win an allowance race 2 back, and then stepped up at a big price in the Sycamore and was not disgraced, finishing fourth behind a limited liability. Just feels like he'd probably need another step forward to be competitive against this field.
He would, as I mentioned earlier, Mike Maker's always dangerous in these longer races, but I prefer some of his others. I was impressed with his debut, not so much the Sycamore. When he tried the longer distance for the first time, his speed figures just don't quite stack up, and he had pretty favorable pace scenarios in both of his recent turf outings.
The number 10, Verstappen, is a horse that feels like he's really come to hand since focusing on marathon distances this year. We'll check out one of his better efforts of the season when he was second behind Channel Maker in the Bowling Green at Saratoga this summer. Came back out of this effort and couldn't quite make an impact in the late stages of that Turf Cup at Kentucky Downs, but it was Kentucky Downs. We've talked about it many times that that's a track that some horses just don't love. He was also a little wide, about 2 to 3 wide around the turn that day and into the stretch in a race that was more dominated by inside runners. So he's been in good form, Craig, but he is a horse that needs the trip to work out.
He needs a trip, but I think his form is a little dirtied up. As you mentioned, that Kentucky Downs race where he basically had no chance being wide around the turn, Get Smoking was allowed an easy lead that day and held on. So I think he's a horse moving in the right direction, still just a 4-year-old. So there's some room for improvement.
The number 11 is Tide of the Sea, who's going to be a big price in this race. He's likely to be a pace factor, if nothing else. This horse can throw in a big effort every once in a while, Craig, like he did off the layoff in the Fort Marcy earlier this year, finishing second at 56 to 1. It's just he's kind of unreliable, and you don't know when he's going to put forth those performances.
And even his best races, I'm not sure are good enough here. The one time he ran the big speed figure was in the Fort Marcy, where he kind of opened up a big lead, just like So High did in his last outing. So it doesn't seem like those tactics would work today. I do think he'll be a pace factor, as we've already mentioned.
Number 12 is Masterpiece, a horse that's looking to get back on track after a poor effort last time in the Arlington Million at Colonial. He was sort of uncharacteristically close to the pace that day, Craig, and that was an honest pace. You see those red color-coded pace figures, and I just think the new style didn't work for him as he went backwards in the stretch. That was a race that was won from far back by the closer set piece. He had been in pretty good form prior to that, especially going back to last winter and spring when he picked up some minor awards and a couple of marathon stakes races Gulfstream Park. If he can get back to that form, he's dangerous here.
He is. He has the numbers to win a race like this. I think I actually picked him in the Arlington Million when we previewed it, if memory serves, and wasn't really happy how close he was to the pace. And it turned out the pace was very fast. So I could see giving him an excuse that day, and he's had a bit of a layoff. He could return with a big race.
I do want to talk about one horse on the also eligible list that would just need one scratch to draw in here. That's the number 13 Classic Catch. This horse would be making his turf debut if he gets into this race. Todd Pletcher has been trying to get this horse on the turf, entering him forward both two back and last time in that Jockey Club Derby, which unfortunately was rained off the turf at the last second. This horse had been training really well on the turf at Saratoga over the summer, and just due to the rain in the area, he hasn't been able to get a chance to try it in the afternoon. But I know Pletcher really wants to get this horse on the grass, and he's even entering him in a pretty ambitious spot here. So in Todd Pletcher, I'm going to trust if this horse gets in.
I agree. When you first sent the graphic, I was just assuming he was a main track only, but I remember back to that interview at Saratoga after he beat Costa Terra, winning that off the turf allowance. And Todd Pletcher seemed very adamant that this was a turf horse and one that he looked forward to getting on. So I agree. If he draws in, he's interesting.
Well, let's throw up our picks for this large field edition of the Red Smith. And Craig, we're going in pretty similar directions, though you put the number 8 Soldier Rising on top, and I fully acknowledge he is the horse to beat. I just don't love horses like this that take money and don't get the job done.
Yeah, I understand that. I mostly picked him, believe it or not, because I said earlier in the year that he was going to win one of these races eventually, and this is probably going to be his last chance. I do think he has a pretty big class advantage over this field, and like I mentioned, I don't really think he's a hanger type or anything. I think he was just getting beat by better horses, should get a good trip here, and just has a good edge over the rest.
Yeah, there are a number of interesting horses in here, but they do have to improve to get on terms with Soldier Rising. One of those is the horse I put on top, the number 7 Marwad, who is second off the layoff. I thought he really showed a lot of talent last winter, and if he can get back to it, I think he could be dangerous in this race at a price. But I would also want to use that number 13 Classic Catch if he draws into the race, because I really did like the way he was training on turf over the summer. So that's a look at the Grade 2 Red Smith, the DRF Saturday race of the day. Good luck if you're playing the races this weekend.